Hi, Tom.
Hi, Paul.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing fine. I'm doing fine.
Great.
So I've been watching these informal conversations that you're having with various friends in recent weeks. I find them really quite fascinating, and they're quite eminent people. They've got a lot to say about their lives and about their opinions. But I think there's something missing, which is I think people would like to know a little bit more about you. I've known you for some 3 decades, and there's all sorts of things I don't know about you. And I think this would be a great opportunity for us to cover some of that ground and let your readers know a little bit about the man behind the dispatches and the articles. So let's start at the beginning, perhaps, and tell me about your parents. Tell me about your upbringing, your education.
Okay. Thanks, Paul. So I come from quite a literary family. Both my parents are very esteemed. Well, my father passed away, but they were both very eminent literary figures mainly in London, though my father also worked and lived in New York. My mother, let's start with my mother. She was born in pre-state Israel in Jerusalem under the British Mandate. She came to England as a child when she was about 10 or 11 years old. English was her 4th language at that point. She went to a sort of so-called progressive boarding school in England. And without a word of English, she became one of the only people in her school to get a place at Oxford to study English literature about 6 or 7 years later. Now, my father, in a way, is even more impressive. He was the youngest person to get I think, scholarship to Oxford, age 16 that year, also to study English literature. They weren't at Oxford at exactly the same time. Both of them then went on for careers in the literary world. My father was mainly a critic, an author, and so on. Wrote books. He was also a literary critic, a theatre critic. And my mother, she was the literary editor, the deputy literary editor of The Observer, which is, the Sunday edition of the Guardian paper. And then she was the women's editor of The Observer. Then she became the arts editor at the Daily Telegraph, and then the literary editor at the Sunday Telegraph. So when I grew up, my parents were very sociable. So we often had guests round, and we often had parties. And later did I realize just how eminent their friends were in the worlds of culture. So there were, for example, all kinds of people, some of which I later realized were Nobel Prize winners, in those parties. I don't know who. There was Harold Pinter and Antonia Fraser and Isaiah Berlin and, philosophers like A.J. Ayer, or I met painters like Francis Bacon, and really very eminent people as well, like my own parents. About my schooling that you also asked, I was lucky in that I went to a very good school. We had to take an exam to get in, which was Westminster, and then I also got into Oxford. So I got a good education, perhaps more at school. I would say at Oxford, I didn't study that much. I'm not sure I learned that much academically, but I had fun at Oxford. Westminster really trained my mind, although I have to say that I'm also a believer in the fact that a formal education is sometimes not necessarily the best education. And indeed, if you don't mind me mentioning yourself, I know that you didn't go to a sort of elite school like Westminster. You went to one of the, worst academic schools in London, and yet you've turned out at least as intellectual as me. So I'm not sure that it's all about schooling. And indeed, I don't want to sound arrogant, but later in life, when I've met professors and people who've won eminent prizes and awards, they're often not that wise or impressive. So just because one's got a good schooling or is a professor doesn't necessarily mean that one's that wise. So I did have a good schooling, but I think a lot of what I learned from my own reading and my own life experiences.
Okay, well, that's extraordinary. Don't get taken in by the beard. That's got nothing to do with any intelligence. It's just because the barbers are still shut.
But just coronavirus, you mean? There's still the lockdown.
Yeah, we're still in lockdown. It means I can't get to a barber, and so yeah, don't get taken into my beard as a sign of intelligence.
I thought you were sort of halfway Sigmund Freud, halfway Theodore Herzl, something like that.
Well, I'm sure it's related to your upbringing. I mean, before we talk about sort of Oxford and the sort of people you were meeting there, let's just dwell a little bit on this quite extraordinary sort of family setting, because the names you've listed are really some of the top minds of the 20th century, and you sort of reel them off as if it's sort of almost normal. Just tell me what kind of conversations, what do you sort of remember about any of these sort of discussions around the dinner table? Because this is quite unusual.
Well, as a child, I probably wasn't quite aware of their intellectual or cultural prowess. And for example, we went on some family holidays, and I now realise that these were quite eminent people. So we went to stay with Antonia Fraser at that was when she was still married to Hugh Fraser, who was, I think, the Earl of Longford, or the grandfather was. So we went to stay in Scotland at their family estate. But I just liked it because I had a big garden to run around. And we went to stay with George Weidenfeld when he took a home in Tuscany. And I do remember something quite nice about that. It was the first time we went to an opera outside in Verona, where there's a Roman amphitheatre, and you hold up candles. So this amazing flicker of candles at this opera. But I was too young to really appreciate the opera, but it was a spectacle. And, you know, we also stayed with the Astors in Clifton and things like this. So I think I only realised later how important these people are. And even as an adult, I realised that I met some of the people I were then reading in literature and so on. Although I want to say they also have lots of friends that maybe aren't world famous, but are very, very accomplished people. Gary and Ruth Runciman were one of my parents' closest friends, and their son David Runciman, who is now an eminent professor of politics at Cambridge University, he was my best friend. But at that age, when we were like 8, 9, 10, we were talking about football and things like that. It wasn't intellectual conversation. But looking back, I guess it's extraordinary, but I kind of just took it for granted, I suppose.
Well, it probably has rubbed off on you more than you are aware. But I mean, just look, I read your father's book. I think it was called A Double Thread. And that gave a real insight into his upbringing and your grandparents. Now, I just go back a generation before your parents and just give a sense of where they came from and what their sort of influence was.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll start with my mother's parents. Okay. My mother's parents were both what I would call as an adult Holocaust refugees. They both escaped Nazi-occupied Europe for what was then British Mandate Palestine. As I mentioned, my mother was born in Jerusalem. So they always had foreign accents, but you know, they were very eminent people, and I got a sense of their importance even as a child. So my grandfather had been a very prominent lawyer in Germany in the 1930s, and indeed he had defended one of the leaders of the Social Democratic Party, who Hitler had accused of being a Bolshevik, a communist. So my grandfather was named as an enemy of the Reich, not just because he was Jewish, but because he was the lawyer for one of the heads of the Social Democratic Party. And then after the war, he was an advisor to Benjamin Ferencz, who was the American lead prosecutor at the Nuremberg war crimes trials. And in fact, Benjamin Ferencz is still alive. He turned 100 this year, 2020, a couple of months ago. And I feel privileged that I've been in correspondence in the past with Benjamin Ferencz, who of course remembers my grandfather. My grandfather was called Kurt May in English. And later on, my grandfather also did a lot to help Holocaust victims, Jewish, but also Roma or Gypsies, as they were known more at the time. So my grandfather was a very impressive person. I was always slightly looked up to him. His wife, Vera, my mother's mother, was also impressive. She spoke better English than my grandfather, so it was in a way we had more conversations. She had trained to be a judge in Germany, which was very unusual to be a female judge. And she was also very brilliant. Look, she was a complicated person, and I think I realized then, but I also realize even more now, that in a way Hitler interrupted her life, and, well, more than interrupted her own life, also murdered her parents and other relatives. And in a way, she never got over that. So, you know, I was close with her, maybe more than my mother was. Sometimes it's easier to skip a generation in bonding. So I was close to my grandmother, Vera. And then on my father's side, his mother, Muriel, she was born in England to parents that had just arrived Jewish again from Eastern Europe. So her family, one of her parents came from Vitebsk, which is now in Belarus. Vitebsk is well known for the paintings of Marc Chagall. I used to joke that in Chagall's paintings, that's our family goat wandering, you know, floating in the skies of one of Chagall's kind of shtetl farm scenes. Then my father's father, he died before I was born. I'm named after him, my middle name, Abraham. And he's the one I know least about because he died some years before I was born. But actually, just recently in this coronavirus lockdown period, I reread my father's childhood memoir, A Double Thread, that you mentioned, and he talks quite a lot about his father and his father's upbringing in a place called Gorokov or Horokov. That was in Poland. When my grandfather left, which was in the period around the First World War, they fled as a result of pogroms, attacks on Jews and economic situation. They went to England, whereas a lot of other Jews who fled either went to New York or to Palestine, to Israel. And I was doing some research on Horokov. I've been reading stuff about it, accounts again of Holocaust survivors. There were 5,000, it was half a town, half a shtetl. This is the region of Europe where I'm sure you've seen Fiddler on the Roof, the famous film with Topol, which, by the way, the creator of Hamilton, the musical, is going to remake Fiddler on the Roof. Anyway, the town of my grandfather was a little bit like that, sort of half town, half shtetl. It was 8,000 population, 5,000 Jews, 3,000 Polish. The Jews were almost all killed by the Nazis and also by the Ukrainian Nazis. The Ukrainian division of the SS did most of the killing in that town. And then there was also a Ukrainian-Polish war after the Second World War, and the Poles were driven out. The borders changed. So that town is now, it was part of the Soviet Union, it's now part of Ukraine, it's now a Ukrainian town. There is no memorial to the Jews there at all, even though there were many synagogues there burned down. And I've been doing quite a lot of research. I found a book written, a biography written about a survivor from that town who died in 2013 in America, and somebody wrote her biography. She lived at the age of 12 for 3 years in the forests near the town and survived by herself after her mother and father and sister had been shot. She survived on insects and bee and berries and things like that. Anyway, so my grandparents played an important role, but I'd say the two grandmothers are the ones I knew better, but I've thought about them quite a lot in a way recently as much as when I was growing up.
I mean, it's fascinating that if you just trace your own family history, you get a serious sense of what Jewish history was like as well. I mean, in a sense, you've got that German and East European background. You've got your own double threads there as well coming through. And then moving forwards, you've got, so your father went to New York, and I can't remember, just explain a little bit what was that, and what was your connection then? Have you retained connections with the US? And
so let me explain. We lived, well, actually I've lived 3 times in New York. The first time when I was an infant, my father got a job. He was mainly a writer and a critic, but he also, for a couple of years, was an academic at that time at Rutgers University, just across in New Jersey from New York. So as a child, we all lived as a family in New York. Then we came back to London. Then my parents got divorced. My mother's now married to the former editor of the Financial Times, Geoffrey Owens. That's another literary or journalistic figure. My father then, after the divorce, got a job at the New York Times. So he moved to New York. The New York Times they really wanted him to come. So they didn't usually give journalists this. They gave him an apartment that they owned on Park Avenue, which is, you know, the nicest street in New York. So my father, who had grown up in somewhat poverty in the East End of London, and you know, I should explain, my grandfather Abraham, who died, he died in Mile End, the East End. So this is the traditional Jewish East End. By then, a lot of Jews had become better off and they moved to northwest London or to Essex. But my grandfather and my father and uncle were still living in the East End, and Mile End is a little bit more gentrified. But in those days, it was really a poor neighborhood. So here we are, my father's suddenly living on the Upper East Side in Park Avenue, working for the New York Times. And then I used to go in all the school holidays, the school vacations. This is in my late teens. So it was quite remarkable. And again, my father he's very charming. Besides being very clever, he's a great conversationalist and very charming. So we met a lot of interesting people. At the time, the world wasn't quite so global. So for example, I remember having my first sushi in New York. And today you have sushi in every village pub all over Europe. But, you know, at the time, sushi wasn't all over the place. It wasn't really in England. It was in Japan and maybe in Manhattan. I remember turning on the TV and there were like 100 TV stations. At the time in England, there were 4 or 5 TV stations. I remember all those skyscrapers, the energy, the buzz. Today, many cities have skyscrapers, but at the time it was amazing. Again, my father, because he was mixing, he was for a short time, he was the editor of the New York Times, the Little Book Review, and then he was a book reviewer for the New York Times. And he also taught 1 day a week at Princeton. He went down to Princeton, and then in another year, he taught at Columbia. So obviously, he also knew a lot of important literary people and society people in New York. But I, as a kind of teenager, or late teen, was more excited. The person I was most excited to meet was someone called Jerry Lieber. Now, who's Jerry Lieber? Have you heard of Lieber Stoll or Stoll Lieber? Okay.
Go on.
They are the songwriters for Elvis Presley. They wrote Blue Suede Shoes, Nothing But a Hound Dog. So here I was, aged, I can't remember, 17 or something. I'm like, oh my God, I'm going for Sunday brunch every Sunday. I'm sitting opposite, chatting to the guy who knew Elvis Presley, wrote all his songs. He also wrote songs for other people like Stand With Me or Stand By Me, and it had just been a big hit as well. So I was very excited to meet, you know, the Elvis connection and this kind of stuff. And again, both Stoller and Lieber had grown up poor Jews speaking Yiddish, so making jokes that, you know, they got some Yiddish tunes and so on, they turned them into Blue Suede Shoes, which by the way, I want to just mention, we have a distant cousin who died, Lionel Bart. Lionel Bart wrote, he wrote the musical Oliver. So he took, as my dad said, the most famous book, or one of the most famous books in English literature, Oliver Twist, and then he turned it into a musical. But what my dad said is, he used all the East End, Yiddish East End music hall tunes, and he just adapted them to the words of Charles Dickens, and he combined Jewish, Yiddish, East End music halls with Charles Dickens to create an Oscar-winning musical, Oliver. Anyway, so New York was very exciting. I also lived there for 2 years later by myself as an adult. Again, I didn't mean it to be, but it was an exciting moment by accident. I arrived there on September 10th, 2001. 1 day later, there was a certain terror attack. I won't go into details, but obviously that was a historic, traumatic moment to suddenly arrive in New York. And the period I was there, those 1 or 2 years, was different than it would have been because of the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks and then the beginnings of the Iraq War and so on. But anyway, until
Well,
now, I feel a little bit American. I feel a connection. I have lots of friends still in America, New York, and so on.
well, we can get on to what you have now subsequently got involved in and the kind of activities and passions. Just one more literary influence which you have left out, which is, I believe, your godmother, Sonia Orwell, who is the widow, or was the widow of George Orwell, that she was also part of your life. Can you tell us a little bit about her?
Okay, so Sonia Orwell was Orwell's second wife. He had an adopted child by his first wife, but Sonia was very young. She was, in fact, the model for Julia, the heroine of 1984. If you remember 1984, Winston Smith, which was modeled in part on Orwell, his love interest is this young, feisty girl, a sort of 19-year-old, whatever she is, called Julia. And she was the model, Sonia. Then Orwell died before they had children together. So Sonia didn't have any children herself. So we had a very strong bonding, she as my godmother. Also, although my parents were good, they were very, very busy working. So in a way, Sonia was there, or at least I felt she was there sometimes when my parents were at work. She sometimes stayed with us. There was a period she was living in Paris, so when she was in London, she used to stay with us. She was also very generous. She was always bringing me nice gifts and presents and so on. Also, of course, when she gave me all the works of Orwell, it was something special getting the works of George Orwell, and of course, not just 1984 and Animal Farm, but all of them. There were many other Orwell writings from his widow, and she herself obviously was a well-known person in cultural circles. So when she died, I was young. I was about, can't remember, about 13 or something. And I read the lesson at her funeral. It was at a Catholic church. And my father told me later that some of the people I met or looked at had been things like relatives of Picasso. Picasso was a friend of Sonia. So even I had heard of Picasso by then. So yeah, but for me, Sonia was just a rather loving, wonderful person, although, you know, she was a complicated, I understand that for adults, she was also a complicated person, as her biographers say. But for me as a child, she was just a loving extra parental figure.
Extraordinary. So from 1984, let's move to 1984, which is, when did you go to Oxford? Was it round about then?
A bit later, a couple of years later.
Okay, so a little bit, 1986. So when you went to Oxford, one would have thought, given your background, that you would have huge sort of literary interests, but you seem then to be much more interested in politics. I think you met a lot of interesting people. I believe Boris Johnson was there at the same time. Yeah. Is this the beginning of your serious political interest? How did it go?
No. My interest in politics stems a little bit earlier. Okay. And it's not, okay, my mother and father and grandparents, of course, they're interested in politics, but they're really literary and cultural people, not particularly political. It's me that's more political. And I would say there are a couple of important things, okay? First of all, there's some trips I made with the same grandmother I mentioned, Vera. When I was 13, she took me to Prague, just me and her. And this is in the deepest, worst communist period. And then a couple of years later, we went to East Berlin. Now, she had lived in East Berlin and she'd also spent a bit of time in Prague. So she wanted to go back and see how Prague and East Berlin, from before the Second World War, from before they were destroyed both by the Nazis and the communists. So we went there. We crossed Checkpoint Charlie in East Berlin. She somehow knew somebody, I don't quite know how, some friend of her father's child or something. He picked us up in this little East German communist Trabant car. And this made me, besides the fact that it was life-forming, this opened my eyes. I even then going from West Berlin to East Berlin was like going from a color film to a black and white film. It was so depressing, East Berlin. There was nothing in the shops. There was hardly anyone on the streets. There was an atmosphere for oppression. Likewise in Prague, it was a beautiful city, but it was deserted. In fact, we stayed in the only nice hotel at the time, which was the Intercontinental. Me and my grandmother were sitting at breakfast. There was almost no one there. There were people who were from the secret police watching us, sitting at other tables. And there were also a couple of other Middle Eastern people. I later found out, much later, that one of them was Carlos the Jackal, the well-known terrorist, who hung out in the Intercontinental Hotel in Prague. At that time, the communist Czechoslovak government was very close to the PLO, and Carlos the Jackal was a Palestinian offshoot of the PLO at that time, and so on. So anyway, to answer your question, this woke me up to human rights, to politics, to how there can be such a difference between a free society like the West. It's not perfect, but compared to those communist repression, it was enormous. Then there was a second reason I became more political. By the time my father had moved to New York, my mother had a lodger. He just got divorced. It was a man called John O'Sullivan. John O'Sullivan was a friend of my mother then had a 4-year relationship with a journalist, quite a well-known journalist called Frank Johnson. John O'Sullivan was Frank Johnson's best friend. John O'Sullivan got divorced. He asked to come and stay. He ended up staying for 2 years. Now, John O'Sullivan at the time was working for Margaret Thatcher as one of her chief advisors in Downing Street. So I used to sit there at breakfast. And this is of course the days before the internet and mobile phones. John O'Sullivan was on the phone talking to other advisors about things like the miners' strike, which at the time in Britain was this huge struggle between Thatcher, who was trying to privatize, and the then very powerful socialistic trade union movement, in particular the miners' union. So John O'Sullivan used to be at one end of the breakfast table discussing political stuff with other Downing Street advisors. And I was at the other end of the table, eating my cornflakes and looking at the comic strips in the newspapers or the football results. And then often, John used to come back in the evening, and I used to be up doing my homework. And I was already interested in politics and history. So John sometimes helped me with my homework. And he chit-chatted to me about political stuff. So I would say the political influences were not my parents or grandparents. They were my grandmother taking me on those trips and John O'Sullivan. So because of that, I chose to study at Oxford PPE, Politics, Philosophy, Economics. But I can honestly say that my professors at Oxford were, if not actually Marxists, they were almost Marxists. And having already been to Eastern Europe, I knew that it was a load of codswallop. Okay, and when you have Oxford professors say things like, well, you know, the health system in Ceausescu's Romania is better than Thatcher's Britain, this was the last year of communism. Of course, it was nonsense. Ceausescu, of course, you know, Paul, but for anyone who doesn't, was the absolute brutal communist dictator of Romania, who, for example, had almost caused through the bad health system. Thousands of Romanian children have got HIV/AIDS. It was a preposterous thing to say. And so, you know, I found out my own political feelings. My best friend at Oxford, Hossein Armini, he had come as a refugee as a child from Iran, his grandfather being prime minister for Iran. He already saw eye to eye with me politically because he knew what dictatorships could do. Him from Iran, me from Eastern Europe. So we weren't having any of this nonsense that academics were trying to, you know, trying to put down my throat at Oxford. So I think I developed my own interest in politics, not necessarily from being taught it. You know, I used to read the newspapers, read books, and I was just interested in the world.
I mean, it is very interesting how you can have a very theoretical education, but nothing replaces actually seeing it with your own eyes, which you did, And it would be very hard to dislodge that kind of impression, especially if you then go and study it and you can apply what you've seen in the theory, and you can see the sort of hypocrisy, which is something that I think a lot of people who don't understand what the Soviet Union was about just simply can't grasp. And so looking back, you obviously had that view, but also just looking forward, because we met actually strangely on a road trip from London to Prague just after the 1989 revolution. So we had 18 hours in a car to discuss all these things, but you'd been to Prague before, I hadn't. And I guess that must have sort of formed the basis of your sort of future activism, because you developed a lot of interest in human rights, but they weren't necessarily the human rights that people sort of at Oxford or other British universities were talking about. I mean, I remember one of the things that really fired you up was the way the Roma were being treated, generally in Eastern Europe, but in particular in Czechoslovakia, as it was then. And that's something you took up with real passion. Just tell me a little bit more about what was driving you there, and how you saw it in the wider sense of your sort of human rights interest.
Okay, so before I talk about the Roma, I should mention that I also went to Prague again, not just when I was 13 with my grandmother. I'd gone back while I was at Oxford, and I'd gone. I had met dissidents, including Vaclav Havel, who had just come out of prison, and he later led the Velvet Revolution. The summer before the November '89 revolution, I'd been in Prague, and how had I met these people? So George Weidenfeld, who I mentioned before, knew everybody, and among the people he knew was a man called Karol Schwarzenberg, who later became Czech foreign minister under Havel. And he also knew, and so did my parents, my mother, a woman called Diana Phipps, who was of Czech origin. She's from the Sternberg family. So they were somehow, Diana Phipps was friends with Havel's first wife, Olga Havel. And my mother had tried to go to Czechoslovakia, but as a journalist, she was denied a visa by the communists. So I went as a student, and I brought stuff for Havel that George Weidenfeld's friends had given me. So I met them in order to give stuff. I met other people, Ludwig Vasulik, Jerzy Diemspeer, who later became foreign minister. So a few months later, communism suddenly collapsed. The Berlin Wall came down almost overnight. It all suddenly fell, well, not overnight, but within a few weeks, one by one, the East European countries collapsed. And then when the Velvet Revolution happened in November 1989, it was incredible. Here were the people I met, and there was something leading a world historic revolution. So I was very eager to return to Prague as soon as possible. So 4 months later, we went with our mutual friend, John Goodman. So I told John Goodman, let's go. And John said, I have this great friend, Paul. So the three of us drove, because at the time there weren't, EasyJet or flights or something. So I remember we drove there. And then I should mention, Paul, that of course you were so excited. It was very bubbling at the time. You moved there a year or two later, and then I moved there a little bit after you, partly because, Prague was a fun place, it's a beautiful place, but it was an exciting place, and so on. So, about Roma. These liberals who had led the revolution, I was very disappointed that they had what I would call a gypsy blindness. They were liberal about everything apart from the Roma. When it came to the Roma, they were as racist as any far-right figure. So they were being liberal about other things, but not about gypsies or Roma. And I already had a sympathy and empathy for the Roma. Why? Because of my grandfather Kurt and the Nuremberg trials. After that, he single-handedly worked with German lawyers on a landmark case, I can't remember the year, it was 1957 or 58, that forced the West German government to admit that they had persecuted Roma on grounds of race. because after the war, the Nazis, they hadn't killed all Roma. It wasn't as efficient as the Holocaust against the Jews. There were some groups of Roma that Himmler said could live and others could die. But they had killed hundreds of thousands of Roma, and some Roma had been tortured as badly as any Jew. For example, Mengele in Auschwitz, he didn't only experiment on Jewish twins, he also experimented on gypsy twins. Sometimes gypsies, Roma, because they had married cousins, they had different color eyes. Mengele removed the eyes without anesthetic of child Roma. So my grandfather had helped Roma. When my grandfather turned 80, gypsies came with gifts for him, bearing gifts. They made him an honorary Roma. So I was age 10 when he became 80. I had sympathy with the Roma already from the age of 10. So I was very excited for the Velvet Revolution. I hated the communists. I was so happy these people were coming to power. And then I was so disappointed that they were being racist against the Roma. So one of the reasons I moved to Prague, or one of the things I did in Prague at that time, was the Czechoslovakia had just split in two. And the Czechs passed a citizenship law in which they tried to define all the Czech Roma as Slovaks, so they would have to go live in Slovakia. In other words, they were trying to ethnically cleanse Roma from the Czech Republic. I wasn't having any of this. I banged on the door of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. They also weren't initially sympathetic. Amnesty International from London, their department that dealt with Czechoslovakia, was run by a Czech guy who was as racist as anyone else about gypsies. I wrote an article in a newspaper that since doesn't exist. At the time, the Prague Post in English, another article in Lidovy Noviny, a Czech newspaper that was translated to Czech, accusing Vaclav Havel and Amnesty International of racism against Roma. Anyway, in the end, the UNHCR, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, got involved after I was banging at their door for a while. And then finally, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International finally woke up to the problem. But it took me 2 or 3 years. Me, and it wasn't only me, there were, half a dozen other people also doing it. But in a way, I, through my parents again, had connections. So for example, Tom Lantos was then a Democratic congressman. He is a Hungarian Jewish Holocaust survivor. This is in the 1990s. And he was the chair of the House of Representatives Foreign Affairs Committee. And through connections of my parents, I managed to get in touch with Tom Lantos. And I helped the House of Representatives drafted a letter to the Czech government that I helped write them, warning the Czechs not to strip Roma of their citizenship. And this intervention by the United States was crucial. And the Czechs reneged on their citizenship law. And then finally, other human rights groups and so on started up on that. And I felt now the big boys are dealing with it and my work is done here.
Mm. I mean, what you say is about this blind spot is quite extraordinary, because as amazing as the likes of Václav Havel and Dean Spear and all those dissidents, and they were truly amazing people, it must have been very disappointing suddenly to see that they were also capable of this blind spot. And clearly
to be fair to Havel, he himself wasn't necessarily racist, he just wasn't interested, but some of them were actually racist.
Yeah. Well, I do remember some quite shocking things that were said, but I guess sort of the echoes of this, people supposedly being thought of as being progressive, capable of this kind of racism and having these blind spots. I mean, we've seen even today the way, well, the Labour Party under Corbyn, how anti-Semitism was just allowed to run riot. Quite disgusting things, really. And I think there's this ongoing fight of people to recognize that racism is not necessarily always on the right, it's often on the left. That your sort of anti-racism, let's say, your human rights work has come from understanding the destructiveness of communism and others, and you've been very sort of nuanced about seeing those differences. So just how does this play out? You've shown the connection between the Roma and the Jews during the war. That's a long conversation which we've had in the past. But talk about anti-Semitism a bit and how your experiences in the past have shaped the kind of fight you fight.
Well, anti-Semitism, as it's said, is the oldest hatred. That doesn't mean it's always Jews who are getting it worse. You know, in different societies at different times, you know, black people in Britain or Muslims may have it worse in certain occasions or certain areas. But if you look consistently over millennium, the Jews are consistently victims. And it's not just, as you said, from the right, it's also from the left. If one studies Soviet anti-Semitism, it's vicious. Stalin was vicious. He executed a lot of Jews. There was a lot of propaganda against Zionism, but they don't care about the Palestinians. It's got nothing to do with the Palestinians. They're just politically correct way of attacking Jews. In fact, if they cared about the Palestinians, they do what I've said all along. They'd encourage the Palestinians to negotiate and get a good deal for a two-state solution, which I've always supported. But actually, they discourage the Palestinians from negotiating because their real motivation, I'm talking about left-wing anti-Zionists, their real motivation is either to keep the conflict going so that the Jews will suffer, both sides will suffer, or to have Israel destroyed. Not a two-state solution, but the destruction of Israel. So not everyone on the left, but some on the left. And I'd also say that, you know, it's not that the left are more racist or more anti-Semitic than the right. Of course, the far right historically are more anti-Semitic. But I'd say that after the Holocaust, the center-right have really looked in the mirror and stopped being anti-Semitic. So you don't see very much anti-Semitism in Britain, for example, in the Conservative Party. Maybe occasionally here or there, but in general you don't see it. Whereas on the left of British politics, as we've seen from the Corbyn era, which came to an end recently, but only a few weeks or months ago, there was a lot of anti-Semitism and vicious anti-Semitism. And, you know, my own feelings about anti-Semitism is I myself am a secular Jew. In fact, I'm an atheist. As long ago as I can remember, I haven't believed in a God. But I've always been proud of my Jewish origins, and I have also experienced anti-Semitism. So at school, there were other school kids who used to say things in, you know, in the locker room after we played football. One of them said, you know, one day we're going to gas you all. So you have straight out anti-Semitism about gassing us all. But for me, even more disturbing was what came more subtle, what came from the teachers. So again, I'm not saying all the teachers, but the deputy headmaster, who was a very prestigious figure, this is Westminster. There was one time when we were on a school trip to the Lake District in the north of England, the countryside, and a group of about 4 of us were being a little bit naughty, nothing much. So the headmaster came up to us and only pointed at me and said, "You are going to be sent back to Golders Green." Now, for anyone who doesn't know, Golders Green is an area of northwest London which is synonymous with its Jewish population, even though, to be quite honest, most of the population there are not Jewish today, or maybe even before. But there's no doubt it was an anti-Semitic thing to say. I didn't grow up anywhere near Golders Green. I grew up in West London. Golders Green is in North London. So it disturbed me more. And I have to say that very same deputy headmaster made another remark, and not about Jews, but he said, communism might not have gone right in the Soviet Union. And this, we're talking about the very end of communism here. We're talking like the 1980s when he said this. But he said it might have been mistakes in the Soviet Union, but it was a resounding success in Mao's China. Now, even I, age 15, already knew that in the Cultural Revolution, Mao had been responsible for tens of millions of deaths. And I'm like, how could he? Okay, how could he? And again, it's because I've been to East Berlin, I've been to Prague under communism. So it's not an accident that the same teacher who was anti-Semitic was also saying that Mao was somehow a good guy. And I bet 10 years earlier, he would have said the same thing about Stalin. So I've always been aware of hatred from the left. And what bothers me more, in a way, about left-wing anti-Semitism than right-wing anti-Semitism is it's clear what right-wing anti-Semitism is. It should be condemned, undoubtedly, but subtle, polite left-wing anti-Semitism that finds its way into some of the reports in the British media, BBC, Guardian, and so on, or at least it did until very recently when the Corbyn lesson has told them not to be. You know, let's compare Israel to Nazi Germany. Let's use phrases in the Independent like the chosen people when we're talking about the Israeli army. Let's talk about the wrath of Moses when Israel is defending itself from a suicide bomb. Let's talk about The Economist magazine referred to Ariel Sharon, the former Israeli prime minister, as Shylock. I mean, what's going on here? They don't do this with any other country. Are they really covering the Israeli-Palestinian dispute? I don't think so. They're letting their anti-Semitism, it's not politically correct in New York or London or Paris to say, I hate Jews. So they'll do it, they'll replace the word Jew with Israel or Zionist, which is why, you know, I've done a lot of this work on this subject in my writings and so on.
Well, the most obvious manifestation of this this sort of passion of yours is in your Middle East dispatches, which have now got quite a huge currency. I mean, there are some top people on your list. It's a private list, if I understand, and it goes to people who are top decision makers, I believe, in the US and in the UK and many parts of Europe and the world. And I think, you know, you have Benny Gantz, I think, who was the deputy prime minister.
Is the deputy.
Boris Johnson and others. So it's a highly informative kind of analysis of what's going on from a very experienced perspective. People really want to know more about it. Just tell me a little bit when you decided that this was the way to be active and to have an influence.
Well, what happened was, it wasn't a conscious decision to do this. What happened was, I was working as a correspondent, Middle East correspondent in Jerusalem for the Sunday Telegraph and also for the New York Daily News. And both those papers are, let's say, they lean right of center. At the time, the Telegraph was owned by Conrad Black. The New York Daily News was owned by Mort Zuckerman. And yet, I was being forced by my editors simply to tell untruths. So, for example, not just about Israel, but about Middle East in general. I remember when Hafez Assad, the dictator of Syria, died, and his son, Bashar Assad, came to power, and he's still in power, Bashar Assad, and he had been an ophthalmologist, an eye doctor in London. And my editor at the Sunday Telegraph, I reported on his coming to power, and my editor said, we have to call him a liberal and a reformer. And I said, but he's not. There's nothing he's done to indicate that he's a liberal or a reformer. And my editor forced me and changed my copy in the Sunday Telegraph to say that Bashar Assad would be a reformer. And I think it's quite clear that not only was Assad not a reformer then, or not only was Assad not a reformer when he unleashed this bloody civil war in Syria of the last 8 years, but in the period before that, he was torturing people, he was massacring people. He is the opposite of a liberal reformer. When it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, I also was forced to say things which were just inaccurate. So, for example, I wrote a line once, something like, the Intifada started, or rather the Palestinians say they launched their Intifada, their uprising, after then opposition leader Ariel Sharon visited the Temple Mount, a site holy to Jews and Muslims. This was changed in the newspaper to General Sharon stormed into a mosque on the Temple Mount. So first of all, he didn't enter the mosque, okay? He went to the Temple Mount. Secondly, it's a site that's holy to Jews and Muslims. It's the ancient Jewish temple. The reason that it later became holy to Christians and Muslims is because it's the ancient Jewish temple. It's the holiest site in Judaism. The Western Wall is the last remaining wall, the Western Wall of the Temple Mount. So when I complained to my editor, why are you calling him General Sharon? And you didn't, for example, call Yitzhak Rabin a general. He was also a general. Sharon wasn't a general, he was a politician. Why are you calling him this? He said, why are you saying the Temple Mount is only a site holy to Muslims, not to Jews? And he said, well, I read it in The Guardian, so they must be right. And I said, but I'm your correspondent. I'm telling you it's holy to Jews and Muslims. And he said to me, and I quote, you're only saying that because you're Jewish. Okay? Now, not only is this complete fake news, but I'll just give you a couple of examples. So at that time, I started my own private email list for friends and family to say things which were accurate, that couldn't even be said in the more right-wing newspapers. Never mind the BBC and the Guardian and the New York Times and the Washington Post, the left-wing media or the liberal media, but the more conservative leading media, you also couldn't say the Temple Mount was Jewish and Muslim. You know, it's not about me being Jewish, it's a matter of accuracy and it's a matter of understanding the conflict. It's all about things like the Temple Mount. If one doesn't understand the Temple Mount is holy to both Jews and Muslims, you don't understand the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. So I started this email list initially for about 25 or 30 friends and family. But because almost all my friends and my parents' friends are journalists, they started forwarding my emails and it just started growing by itself. And I was covering material that you couldn't find in the media. Today, you can find more of that stuff. The media is more balanced. But at the time, it just kind of built itself up. Initially, in media circles, lots of people wanted to know what was happening, which they couldn't read in the newspapers. And then over time, other people joined, people in governments, people even in security forces, in intelligence agencies, retired people from intelligence agencies who I'd met at conferences. I was amazed that I would be telling them something they couldn't know, but apparently they were things that they couldn't find out about, and they were happy to hear them from me. So look, much later on, when I stopped being a working reporter, I also did some consultancy and training. So for example, I did, on behalf of a private group of former security people, I did some training for security forces from other countries, not about security, because I have no background in security or in intelligence, but about media. So they wanted to know, how do we cooperate with the media in an ongoing hostage situation? Because if you remember, there was the Mumbai terror attacks in India on 2 hotels and some other train station. And in one of the hotels, the Indian television station broadcast the Indian security forces entering the hotel, and some of the kidnappers and terrorists watched on TV in the hotel room the terrorists coming in, and they shot some of the hostages and moved the others because the Indian television gave away by filming. So my advice was how to set up ground rules with CNN and the others to cover terrorism, but not interfere in a way that hostages might die. So what I want to say is, by then, this private group of individuals was very well connected. So they had people, for example, I won't mention where it happened, but it happened in Europe, this training session. They had people from Singapore, the head of Department of Homeland Security from Singapore, the head of the intelligence services of Singapore, the head of the military intelligence of Thailand and others. So I started to meet all these security figures, and they also joined my email list, and they also asked other people to come on it. So at some point, it didn't only have a lot of media figures and political figures, it had really quite important people in the security and intelligence field. And I've done this for quite a number of years, although to be honest, I'm a bit exhausted from doing it now. It takes a lot of my time. And I also think the media even though we're living in an era of polarization and so-called fake news, I actually think the media is better than it used to be because of the internet, because it's so easy to find information. Anybody who really wants to find something out, it's quite easy today. There are so many websites and there's so many good writers and so on. So I continue my list. And as you say, there's some very important people, cabinet ministers from a number of countries, America, Britain, and some other countries are on this list. And they still read me, but at the time I was starting it in those first years, I'd say it was more important. It was really crucial at that time. It's still important though.
Yeah, I don't think people understood, now that the media has fractured so much, and as you say, there are so many other channels. When you started off, it was quite a sort of bold experiment in a way to see whether you could get your position and your understanding of a situation through to the top readers, because as you pointed out before, certain people will read their go-to newspapers or BBC or whatever, and that's it. Now, as you say, things have moved on.
Right, only up to a point. There's still a lot of polarization, and people on Facebook, for example, people stay in their circles of like-minded people, and then and I make a point of reading everything. I read from left to right. I read different perspectives. I read British perspectives. I read Arab papers, Israeli papers, American papers, from all over the place. I sometimes look at the websites of Hamas, of the Iranian government, of the Assyrian government. I want to see what they're saying.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is where your personal passion and your personal experience is so intertwined with the big sort of geopolitical trends in so many ways. And it reminds me, you were talking about the Holocaust before, perhaps because parts of your family had lived through it and had in a way has passed some of that on to you. I mean, there's a certain, passion, even fury, in terms of you wanting to right these sort of injustices that seems to be in your history a lot, in your personal history. Just tell me a little bit more about how the influence of the Holocaust has been personal.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. As I've got older, I've actually thought about it more, but I don't think it's just me. This year marked the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz in January. And this was before the coronavirus lockdown had started, and there had never been such a big gathering. First of all, at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, the Holocaust Memorial, and then a day or two later at Auschwitz itself in Poland. There had never been such a gathering of important world leaders. The German president spoke in Hebrew. He learned Hebrew for a speech in Jerusalem, in Yad Vashem. Prince Charles, who had never been on an official trip to Israel, and whose own grandmother in Greece, his father's mother, had helped shelter Jews in the war, finally came to an event at Yad Vashem. So it's not just me. There has never been so many books, so many films, discussions, TV documentaries, and in a way, it's very belated. I think it was often too painful, even for the survivors, to talk about. For decades, they just couldn't talk about it psychologically, and those that did couldn't get their books published. So two of the very greatest writers, Primo Levi, maybe the greatest writer among the survivors, not the greatest historian, but the greatest of all the great writers, survivors. I would name Primo Levi, and I would also name Aaron Appelfeld, who's not so well known. He's brilliant, brilliant. And then another writer who is well known, Elie Wiesel. Both Elie Wiesel and Primo Levi could not get their books published. And when they did, it was in very small imprints. Simon Wiesenthal, the Nazi hunter, he was knocking on doors. No one wanted to listen to him. And indeed, many Nazi war criminals went about living their lives. They went back to doctors who had tortured children and medically experimented on little Jewish children before killing them, then just went back to open medical practices in Austria and Germany, and no one cared, okay? Others escaped to Brazil and Argentina with the help of the Vatican and the Red Cross. So I have got more interested, like society have. I'm not sure it was, my mother doesn't talk about it very much. Her grandparents, she never met them. We now know they were killed in Treblinka. But we couldn't find this out. That's the death camp in Poland. It took decades for me to find this out. Let me tell you something interesting. The Second World War finished in May 1945, about the 7th or 8th of May 1945. My grandmother went from Jerusalem by herself. She left my mother, who was about 6 years old, with, we had my grandfather's brother, who had been in Buchenwald in 1938, had managed to get out, and he'd managed to come with his mother. So some other relatives had managed to reach Jerusalem. So my mother was left there, and my grandmother went to Germany by herself to look for her parents. She hadn't heard from them from 1941. She was one of the very first Jews to travel from Israel to Germany 2 weeks after the war ended. And she went, obviously she couldn't find them. She went to Gestapo headquarters. She found a record of their summons for deportation. It was the 75th birthday of my grandfather on which he was deported. Most of the Jews who were deported that day had gone to Auschwitz. She didn't know that whether he went to Auschwitz, but she presumed that was his fate too, okay? They hadn't been seen since 1941, 40. He was deported in 1942, but she hadn't heard from him from 1941. Now, my grandmother never mentioned this to my mother. My grandmother told me this when she was already more than 90 years old. And now I recognize that it's one of the most important moments, maybe not just in my grandmother's life, but even for my mother without knowing it, because my grandmother must have returned a different person. So here's a little 6-year-old girl and her mother comes back and she's found out what happened to her family. And she never speaks about it, at least not then. I mean, obviously my mother knew that her parents were killed, but she didn't speak about it very much. It was too difficult for her to speak about. Also on my grandfather's side, this is my mother's father, it turns out that a cousin, Jeff Meyer, in Australia, read some articles of me, heard me mention my grandfather in one of them, then found me on Facebook to tell me he was a cousin. I'd never heard of him. So his mother, or I can't remember the exact name, but his mother or grandmother was the sister of my grandfather's mother. His grandmother was the sister. So he tells me, and he's got photos, and he's showing me photos of my own great-grandmother, who I know it's her, because I saw have also a photo of the same woman from my grandfather. They were 5 sisters, okay? So, and one brother. Only my great-grandmother survived, but we never mentioned that. So only one person that photo survived. That would be the same great-grandmother that managed to reach Jerusalem in 1939 with her son who'd been in Buchenwald. Anyway, so the more I see history, the more important I think the Holocaust is to not just me, not just the Jews, but more importantly, to the history of Europe, and in some senses to the history of the world. And of course, not just the Holocaust. I'm glad that at the present time, there's a re-examination of the legacy of slavery to the United States. And there hasn't been enough discussed about it. I wasn't taught enough about it at school. For America to move forward, they need to really examine the legacy of slavery. And for Europe to move forward, not just Europe, because unfortunately anti-Semitism is a global thing. So I'd say the whole world, they really need to understand anti-Semitism. It's not just Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party or a few other people. They haven't even begun to understand the Holocaust. The Holocaust, anti-Semitism didn't just start with Hitler and end with Hitler. In fact, you said to me, Paul, when we were talking about contemporary anti-Semitism, where did people think it all went? They think it all just disappeared after Hitler. It's there, it's just buried, it just pops up in other ways, often through anti-Zionism. Sometimes it's subconscious, sometimes people aren't even aware what they're saying. But one more interesting thing I want to mention before we leave the Holocaust. So we presumed, as I said, that my grandmother's parents had been taken to Auschwitz. And I had done some internet searches. I did a fresh one when sitting in an internet cafe in Prague in 2011. And I did it then because my father just passed away and I was interested in family history. And suddenly I found full details of what happened. And the remarkable coincidence was it was being stored across the road from the cafe in the offices of the Jewish Museum of Prague on a website called holocaust.cz. So what had happened? They had gone to Theresienstadt, which is the concentration camp or ghetto north of Prague. And in Terezin, the Nazis had done full details of everyone who was there and full details of where they went after they were deported from there and which trains they were on, which are the other passengers on that train. So after the communists had just left all these archives gathering dust in Theresienstadt, in Terezin. And then some years after the end of communism, the local council in Terezin decided to hand over these boxes to the Jewish Museum, and they slowly started scanning tens of thousands of data online. So sometime between about 2007 or 8, when I last checked, and 2011, not full details of my great-grandparents, all kinds of stuff there, but because the Nazis kept full records, there was lots of information on them there. So I now know, as my grandmother told me, they were indeed deported on my grandfather's 75th birthday. And then several months later, they were deported to Treblinka in a cattle train with exactly 2,000 passengers crammed into a train meant for a couple of hundred people. And they were gassed upon arrival, as the Nazis had written in their notes in Theresienstadt. So I found out what happened to them. More lately, I've been doing some research about my grandfather, both my grandfather's sides of the Holocaust, but I won't go into it now because I don't want to go into too much detail about that. But in any event, some people think we already know too much about the Holocaust. I think that the vast majority of people, and that includes a lot of Jewish people, don't know enough.
I absolutely agree. And with every new book and every piece of research, more extraordinary stories come out. People have no idea what life might have been like before the war. And it's one of these things where every story, those who've survived and those who didn't, is just the most unbelievable thing, far beyond anything we understand today. I guess, go on.
I just want to say one thing. It's also the sheer sadism. So for example, last year I was in Vienna and I was with my lovely, charming daughter, Sivan. So besides the fact we went to some museums and so on, we went to the amusement park, the famous Prater. But I happen to know one fact about the Prater, the big wheel, which is not mentioned anywhere in the Prater, no memorial plaque. Before the Holocaust, in 1937 or 38, they strapped Jewish professors to the wheel, and then they made it go round so fast that they passed out. The same professors, some of which among them were Nobel Prize winners or people on their way to winning Nobel Prizes, they made them clean the streets of Vienna with toothbrushes. 1/3 of the Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra were Jewish, 1/3 volunteered to join the SS. So the 1/3 of the non-Jews volunteered to join the worst of the worst among the Nazis in order to help kill the other Jewish musicians. So it's beyond comprehension. It's not just about 6 million dying. It's not just a number. The sheer sadism by, at the time, Berlin and Vienna and Budapest and Prague, these are the most civilized societies in the history of mankind. The people that carried out the Holocaust, many of them were highly civilized people. And this is what makes it so shocking and so important to learn about it.
Well, I think that, and there's another dimension of this, which you sort of imply here, which is as Holocaust survivors die out, how do we pass this on to the next generation? How do those stories get conveyed? I mean, you mentioned your daughter. How does one sort of allow the memories and the thinking and the sort of understanding to get passed on down the generations. I mean, we're running out of time, but maybe you can just sort of talk about that generational thing, what, you know, the people that are important to you that you would like to sort of
I won't talk about my daughter's a bit young still, but in general, I think, I mean, thankfully, there are still some survivors alive. They're a tough lot. And remember, some of the people that survived, the reason they survived, they were about 15 or 16. They were very, very fit. Older people already died in the camps. So there are survivors alive for a little while longer, but it's only a few more years. So I think it's incredibly important for people to continue with Holocaust education for everyone, not just to remember the victims, but for everyone. We have to understand what it is, because I don't think anyone in their right mind thinks slavery is okay. But you know what? Quite a lot of people still think anti-Semitism is okay. And Holocaust isn't just about killing people, it starts with incitement. Maybe just to end on a slightly more upbeat note, because I've got a less serious side too. You know, at one point, in fact, when I was living in Prague and you were also living in Prague, I was doing some stuff for MTV Europe. They were doing music videos. I was helping out on that. And I was also involved in some fashion magazines. So one person who influenced me with that was my uncle, Tony, who's a fashion optician. These are one of his glasses, Tony Gross. And he didn't have children. I was very close to him. He was a little optician, Jewish optician from the East End of London, who then almost invented fashion optics in the 1970s. He was friends with Elton John. He persuaded him to wear different glasses with different outfits. And he also grew quite successful in the visual side of things, just like my father was successful with words and literature. My uncle was successful with looks. And in the end, he had all kinds of, you know, prominent friends and customers, you know, Madonna and Tina Turner, and he made glasses for James Bond films. So I don't only want to pass on the Holocaust to the younger generation, I want to pass on the fun side of stuff and the great English literature, the love for literature that my mother and father have as well. So both things are, of course, important.
All right. Well, we have run out of time. It is, once we start talking about the war and the Holocaust, it's very difficult to move on from there. But, you know, there's so many, it's a very enlightening conversation, and I think surprising as well. I think people, your readers and those, will get quite an insight into what kind of background you've had and the kind of way you've sort of come to your points of view and the passion that you hold, which I think has been quite forceful. So look, it's always great talking to you. It's always great debating with you. We will speak again very soon. And yeah, I look forward to that. And thanks very much for having this conversation.
Thank you, Paul, and see you soon.